issue with self-identified Republicans versus Democrats. But even Scott Rasmussen, who tilts a bit to the right, is basically right in the fold now with all the other polls, showing this essentially tied. So what I look at, since I'm a political junkie, every morning I look at the website realclearpolitics.com. They take every poll in the country, consolidate them, and come up with a number. This afternoon they had Romney ahead by, I think, 3/10 or 4/10. In other words, almost exactly a tie. The other thing I look at that some people feel is predictive is the Gallup website, www.gallup.com. It's a free website. And in the upper right-hand corner, every afternoon at 1 o'clock in the East, 12 o'clock here, they have a new number, the President's Job Approval Rating. My good friend Charlie Cook, who's one of the best in the business at handicapping things like this, says that if the Obama job approval rating is over 50, he'll probably win. If it's under 45, he'll probably lose. During the summer, Obama was 44, 45, 46, 44, 47. In the last few weeks, he's been a little over 50. I think this afternoon he was 49 or 50. That's significant, and that may be a tip-off that he still is the very, very slight favorite. So I look at that every day for possible trends. Well, if Obama does win with 280, just barely, a really extraordinarily close race, he got 365 4 years ago. Does this mean that he'd be able to bring a more activist legislative agenda, that he would worry the financial markets, that all of a sudden we're going to have another move back to the left? I would argue no, because there's another election to talk about. And that other election, obviously, is the election for Congress. The House is an easy call. The magic number is 25. There's no way the Democrats are going to get 25. They might get 6 or 8 or even 10. But a year from now, John Boehner will still be Speaker of the House, always looking nervously over his shoulder at Eric Cantor, the very conservative #2 guy in the House, who's a very ambitious politician. The House will stay plenty conservative. The more interesting story, of course, has been the Senate. And everyone's focusing correctly on whether the Republicans can gain control, and that story's changed in the last 6 months. I think it's unlikely that they'll gain control for 2 reasons. The first is many of the Republican seats that looked safe don't look as safe anymore. We all knew that the Olympia Snow seat in Maine would go to the Democrats, but now several other states are in play. It looks like in Massachusetts, the Native American Elizabeth Warren is now thank you very much, that Elizabeth Warren is now slightly ahead of Scott Brown. There are 2 or 3 other races, maybe including the Dick Lugar seat in Indiana, that are in play. The second reason, of course, is that several seats that the Democrats have that I thought would have been very shaky look a little more solid right now. And I think you've got to say that we're in one of those states where I thought I would have bet a large sum of money that the Democrat would lose. And I think whether you agree or not, I think that you have to say Claire McCaskill is one of the luckiest women in America. So I think the Republicans probably will not quite get control of the Senate. But the real story is this, that the new Republicans will have several Tea Party members. So if Mitch McConnell only gets net 2 seats, he's going to get several Tea Party people because Republicans who are retiring, like Kay Bailey Hutchison in Texas, will be replaced by a Tea Party type, Ted Cruz, a very conservative fellow who will win in Texas. So I would argue the Senate will get significantly more conservative. Moreover, several members of the Senate who like to compromise are leaving. Joe Lieberman, retiring. Olympia Snow, retiring. Lugar, defeated. Ben Nelson in Nebraska, going. So I think that if Obama wins, not only will he have a very conservative House to deal with, but I think the Senate will get more conservative as well. So I don't see, as I move to another big theme, what happens after the election, I don't see the president being able to get a heck of a lot done. We'll get a clear signal around Thanksgiving because Tim Geithner will retire. Hillary will as well. And if Obama replaces Geithner with the name that I keep hearing, that would be a tip-off that he might try to get something done. That name is Erskine Bowles, a moderate Democrat, a deficit hawk, highly respected in both parties. If it's Bowles, that might open some eyes that maybe we can get things done. If it's somebody like Elizabeth Warren, we're in for a long 4 years without getting much done at all. Even if it's Erskine Bowles, I want to make this point. I am not a believer that we're about to see some big deficit reduction. I love Simpson and Bowles. They're great Americans. They sincerely want to do the right thing. But Simpson Bowles was put on the floor of the House in May. 435 members of the House, right? It got 38 votes in the House. I don't see a mood right now that is conducive for a big deficit deal for two reasons. The first is the Treasury 10-year bond deal is 1.70. The bond market vigilantes are nowhere to be seen. Maybe Bernanke plays a role in that, but without an angry market, there is no catalyst. There is no force saying to Congress, for God's sake, do something. You know, maybe the credit rating agencies will inject themselves during the winter. It's possible, but I don't see a market catalyst to get them to cut deficits. The second reason is that there's no agreement on anything. There's no agreement on taxes and on entitlements. And the example I point out, and I don't know if I should laugh or cry, is that they can't reform the post office. This summer, the post office went to Congress and said, we want to close on Saturdays. We want to close all these post offices. And the members of Congress who all piously say they want to cut deficits were too chicken to do anything with the post office because they were afraid they were going to get angry phone calls and emails from East Buffalo, Nebraska, because you closed my post office. So if they can't reform the post office, that doesn't bode real well for entitlements. I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to get a big deal. Well, what if Romney wins? What would happen if he wins? Let me just make this point. I travel all around the country and I see professional investors. I have never seen a split like the split I see right now in the investment community. It's probably 80-20 for Romney. 4 years ago, it was about 50-50. Even people on Wall Street, like Jamie Dimon, were intoxicated, intrigued by Obama. They supported him. These people have moved back. I've never seen anything like 80-20. I would think that if Romney wins, it would be well received in the markets. Yet there's been a lot of buzz today, including a story in the New York Times, that as Romney looks like he has a chance, the markets may be getting concerned about one big story. And that one big story is the stridency of Romney's comments toward Ben Bernanke. I would agree Bernanke's not perfect, but I've always said when the politicians start telling the Fed what to do, whether it's Barney Frank on the left or Ron Paul on the right, my attitude is, gee, you guys have done such a great job on fiscal policy. You want to dictate monetary policy now? So I think there is some concern. And if Romney wins, he gets his chance to replace Bernanke, who will not seek another term in 15 months. Bernanke's going to leave in January of 2014, and Romney can get Marty Feldstein or Glenn Hubbard or Greg Mankiw, some very solid people who would be in line. But I think the markets would be worried if a new president began his first term with a public dispute with the Fed. I think that is one concern. But I'd say in general, the markets, I think, would receive this pretty well. Well, there's one final thing I have to spend a minute on, and that is, to me, a story that is more troublesome than the fiscal cliff, QE3, slow economy, anything you want to talk about. And that is the great wild card in the world today, and that's Israel-Iran. It has heated up over the last few months once again. And I will just report to you that after years of all of us who follow this saying the issue is whether Netanyahu would move, all of a sudden in the last couple of months, the issue has become when Netanyahu will move. I'm not saying it's certain, but more and more people are gaming out the scenarios. Could he move before the election? I doubt that very much. Could he move this winter? Can't rule it out. I had a speech 2 weeks ago, and after me was the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I said, General, when are the Israelis going to move? He said, this winter, matter-of-factly. He didn't hedge it. He said, they're going to move this winter. What's changed? What's changed is most experts, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, now feel the Iranians will have a crude bomb by next summer. That has really speeded up the timetable for Netanyahu to have to do something. I see no sign that the Ayatollahs are willing to compromise. Ahmadinejad is a puppet. He's not significant. But the Ayatollahs, despite crushing economic sanctions, their currency is in free fall. The Iranian economy is in shambles. I see no willingness for them to negotiate. I have heard all the arguments back and forth that why this wouldn't happen. The Israeli generals have misgivings. The Israeli public opinion is not unanimous. There are some daunting things you have to do with these nuclear facilities in the mountains, buried deep into the mountains near Qom, but there are bunker-busting bombs that could take out a lot of them. I'm not going to predict tonight that the Israelis will move this winter, but I will predict tonight that concern over this is going to grow significantly. And maybe it will lead to a third party, maybe China, certainly not Putin. He'd be happy to have oil at $200 a barrel. But I think that some intermediary might inject themselves. There might be some consensus that cyber terrorism, which has worked in the past with the Stuxnet virus, could be effective. But I would say that as we get into the winter, concern over this is going to grow. Well, rather than end on that very somber note, let me just make one other point, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think there's an awful lot of stories just beneath the radar screen that nobody's focusing on now that are almost all positive. And perhaps as we get into the summer of 2013, once we're done with the fiscal cliff and Israel-Iran may be resolved, then I think people will look at these very positive stories that I'm sure Gene and his colleagues are aware of. One is that the U.S. is close to becoming a net energy exporter. The energy surge in the U.S. is extraordinary. In the Dakotas, I talked to someone the other day from North Dakota. He said, you know, half the farmers are selling their land and moving to South Beach, Florida. You know, it's a hell of a story in the Dakotas. The manufacturing sector looks a lot stronger. The housing market, I think, quite clearly has bottomed. I think when you look at the states, 48 of the 50 states look pretty good. They've gotten their expenses under control. They don't have deficits. We're down to just 2 states that are out in Pluto or Neptune. That's Illinois and California, of course. But 48 out of 50 ain't bad. You've got more and more politicians in both parties, not just Republicans, now realizing you've got to go after municipal employee benefits. Andrew Cuomo in New York took on the unions and won. There's a very impressive young woman in Rhode Island who's the state treasurer, a Democrat who took on the unions and won. I think you can do it rough, like Chris Christie, or you can do it a little more conciliatory. But in both parties, there's a consensus. You've got to go after these benefits. And finally, the big story of all that I mentioned at the beginning is that never in my life, in any of our lives, have we seen corporate balance sheets look as fabulous as they do right now. And I would predict once we get some certainty, some predictability on taxes, these companies will be just itching to spend some of that money on new hiring, new plant and equipment. So I think there's a lot of positive stories as we get well into next year. The problem is we got to get from here to there. And I think it could be a rocky ride over the next 2, 3, 4 months. So I'm going to stop there. I'd love to take questions, disagreements, whatever. I know we have some people in the room who will have microphones. So just raise your hand and hopefully we'll have time to get a few questions in. There's a gentleman right down here for whoever's got the microphones. And I think there might be another hand in the back. So,
what's the economic impact if Obamacare is fully implemented?
Well, if Obamacare is fully implemented, I would say, first of all, if he wins, Obamacare will put in some pretty deep roots. And we can call it Obamacare now. He told us we could in the first debate. So I'm not being pejorative. I think it would put in some pretty deep roots, and it would be very hard to extract. I've talked to people in the healthcare industry who've said, we just want to be able to plan. You know, they were not thrilled about the Supreme Court ruling, but at least it gives them some direction. They know that if Obama wins, that it will put in deep roots, and they can probably deal with many of the provisions. Personally, I don't like that 3.8. I think that an increase in capital gains taxes, I think, is not a good idea. And I would like to see that changed. I'm not sure that would happen. If Romney wins, I think there's a decent chance it could be undone. If Romney wins, I'm told by people who study this that he probably would only need 50 votes in the Senate, not 60. And I think even if he's short by 1, if the Republicans are at 49, and the story that I didn't mention just for the sake of brevity is that in 2014, there's at least half a dozen, maybe 8 Democrats who look really shaky. Mary Landrieu in Louisiana, a state that's moved much to the right. I think there are some shaky Democrats that Romney could pick off and get defectors and eliminate Obamacare. Now, Romney's made it a little confusing by saying he likes the stuff about pre-existing conditions and insuring your kids up to the age of 25. I don't think you can get that if you kill the mandate. They are not mutually exclusive. So I do think that there is a chance, though, if Romney wins, that you could kill Obamacare. If Obama wins, I think it's here to stay, and I think there will be some negatives, certainly in terms of the capital gains rate. Other questions? Gene, I think people haven't had enough to drink tonight. If there's no, maybe they need to drink more after hearing me. I see another question. And then there's a gentleman, the next one, there's a question right down in front. But let's take this gentleman up here.
What about the possibilities of the Bush tax cuts, being repealed and retroactive?
Yeah, that's the scenario I would give if Romney wins, that if they're repealed, if they're not extended, I think that by the end of January, early February, a President Romney would move to re-extend the Bush tax cuts. I think that's a pretty easy call. That's the simplest of all of the tax scenarios out there. But you would have at least 2 months with all of these tax rates higher. I would hate to run the payroll department of a big company. I would hate to be an accountant, a CPA, trying to figure out all of these tax changes. But I do think if Romney wins, he would move to reinstate the Bush tax cuts probably by late winter. There's a question down here. There's a gentleman here. And I can probably repeat it if you just ask me. Yeah.
We keep hearing about this payroll tax cut.
Yep.
Maybe not. Is it not a Social Security tax cut?
Yes.
Why don't we call it what it is?
Yes.
Number one.
Yes.
And number two, what's that going to do to the Social Security trust fund?
Yes. That's why the question the gentleman asked was the payroll tax cut not being extended. I think more and more people view it correctly as a raid on the Social Security Trust Fund. And in both parties, there's growing anxiety over continuing to do that. And I think that's the major reason why we're probably not going to get the payroll tax cut extended. In the last week, there have been some people like Larry Summers who said we probably should extend it. But I think the momentum is against extending it, and it is because of the Social Security Trust Fund. You know, I didn't talk at great length, and I won't now, about entitlements. But let me just say, I do think there's a climate conducive to reform of Social Security. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You basically raise retirement ages. You know, for someone like me, you know, if you're a physical laborer, if you've been a nurse, if you've been a construction worker, I think going up to 70 is a bit much. But I sit on my butt most of the time. I just fly on airplanes all day long. I mean, I can certainly wait till I'm 70 to get retirement benefits. I don't see that as being harsh. And I do think there's a climate conducive toward Social Security reform. I do think we can get that. The problem is, and I think Obama would go, I'm told in private, Obama says he would like that to be one of his legacies if he's reelected. The problem is the Democrats will not agree to significant Social Security reform without an accompanying revenue increase, an accompanying tax hike, and that's where you get the impasse. Other questions? Way in the back. Yep.
I was just curious, when you were talking about Iran, there's thousands of demonstrations taking place daily in the small villages to medium-sized towns in Iran.
Yep.
The sanctions are working, and I truly think that sometime in the next year or two, that regime will have great problems internally.
I would even argue that I wouldn't be shocked if Ahmadinejad is gone in the next few weeks. He's a convenient scapegoat. The country, their economy is in free fall. Where I would perhaps disagree with you, sir, is that yes, there are protests. But I think if the protests really heated up, we've seen clear examples by the Revolutionary Guards who have all the guns in Iran, that they'll kill people. They kill people on the campuses at the University of Tehran. They would probably follow the example of Bashir al-Assad in Syria, their great ally, and just kill dissidents. And one of the tragedies in Iran is that all of the opposition forces are unarmed. It's going to be pretty tough to overthrow these ayatollahs. I could see Ahmadinejad go because the sanctions are really biting. But getting rid of the ayatollahs, boy, I'd like to believe it, but it's going to take a lot of violence for that to happen, an enormous amount of violence.
I think that's what you're going to see coming up in the next year or two. The people have gotten to the point where they don't have food, they don't have the materials they need.
Yep.
It gets to the point where you either fight or you die.
Yeah, I would just argue that the protests would have to largely be peaceful, and the Revolutionary Guards will slaughter peaceful protesters. They've already shown a willingness to do that. So one of the great tragedies, I think, I'm just going to morph into one other theme here, is that the Arab Spring which started with a Tunisian who killed himself because his life was so miserable, set himself on fire. This spread throughout North Africa and much of the Arab world. And instead of bringing, some kind of Jeffersonian democracy, has brought the more radical elements have used this as a pretext to get more powerful. And in all these countries now, you've got to worry about the Chador coming back, the Share law coming back. So what looked like a very wonderful, optimistic story is now turning into like the French Revolution, where we went to Robespierre and Danton, and it got crazier and crazier. So I worry that any kind of peaceful protest, even in Syria, could backfire. And I hear McCain and everyone saying we have to get much more involved in Syria. I don't know who to support in Syria. I mean, you don't know who's Al-Qaeda in Syria, who's Hezbollah in Syria. So it's a muddled story. I would like to think that the Ayatollahs could get overturned, but I'd say the odds against that are awfully long. It would take a lot of blood for the Ayatollahs to get overthrown, in my opinion. Maybe one or two more. Yes, sir. If there's a gentleman down there, if someone with a microphone wants to see him. I'm a real barrel of laughs tonight, huh? Yes, sir.
Two questions. One, relations with Russia under the new czar.
Yep.
And how that affects U.S. foreign policy. And secondly, what the Chinese economy looks like and what the impact of that might be on the U.S. economy, given they own most of the country.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, I wouldn't trust Putin as far as I can throw him. I think he's an enemy of the United States. He has not helped us on any significant issue. I think that he would, as I said earlier, I think he'd be thrilled to see the price of oil go to $200 a barrel if there's a Middle East war. I think he's a bad guy. I'm not sure about Medvedev. I think Medvedev is someone we can deal with, but Putin is not, in my opinion. As far as China goes, there's a lot of smart people right now who I respect, who know more than I do about China, who say we have to worry down the road, because the Chinese time frame is not the next year or two. Their time frame is like 50, 60 years. And I think that they are setting themselves up to become the dominant power in the world. They're cutting oil deals with Chavez and Venezuela. They are looking at the long, long, long term. We can't decide what tax rates are going to be like in January. And here's China making plans way, way down the road. I think in the short run, the Chinese seduce us because they're pretty pragmatic. I mean, they'll go right to the edge on currency manipulation, but the last thing they want is a trade war. I think that they have a pragmatic streak that you have to respect. And you got to respect the fact that they could lean on North Korea. And lately they've gotten closer to Pakistan, which I always remind people has 100 nuclear bombs in Pakistan. So we need China. It can be a constructive force. But I worry down the road about one issue that is just now starting to percolate. And if I'm lucky enough to be back here after depressing everyone tonight, maybe in a couple of years, we'll talk about cyber terrorism. And I think industrial espionage is one of the next great stories that we're going to have to worry about. The Chinese are really good at industrial espionage. The Russians are pretty good at it. Even the Iranians, according to Leon Panetta last week, have hacked into some US banks and have hacked into the Saudi oil system. So industrial espionage, cyber terrorism is one story that I'm going to worry more and more about in the next few years. And that's an issue where the Chinese are deeply involved, and I think that's a real concern. One other point I'd make on China. If there is a nasty war in the Middle East, I would argue that China may have more to lose than any other country, because a global economic slowdown would clearly hurt the Chinese and their export industry. And you might even get concerned about social unrest if the Chinese economy were to really falter. Again, I'm not predicting that, but I see some bumps in the road ahead for China after the last couple of decades. Maybe one more, and then I'm going to get the hook. We got the dreaded last question, Gene, and then I'll turn it over to you. Yes, sir.
If the Democrats are going to control the Senate, how can Obamacare be repealed?
Oh, I think if the Democrats control the Senate by 51-49, as I said, I think some Democrats can get picked off. Mary Landrieu is in a really tough fight in Louisiana. There's a guy named Begich in Alaska, a Democrat who I think could lose in 2014. There's a Democrat in Arkansas who I think could lose. So there are several Democrats who I think could be persuaded to defect. And I think Romney could get 2 or 3 Democrats to get to 50, 51, 52 if he had to do that. Well, as always, you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. Very enlightening conversation, and we'll look forward at some point in the future to some more cheer about industrial espionage and the like. So I hope you'll all stay. We have lots of food, lots of drink, some dessert, some TVs. And I want to compliment the ultimate party planner, Nancy Pritchard, wherever you are. She's our head of marketing and communications, and she put this all together. The ultimate party planner for all the Cardinals fans arranges for a rain delay, in case you haven't been on your phone, that is still going on. The tweeters are upset that it's been 15 minutes without any rain and still no activity on the field, so we timed this perfectly. Thank you all for being here, and we'll look forward to seeing you outside for a while. Thanks.